forced to marry her sister's fiancé. The Mafia boss did not care. He said, "You are mine now." He was supposed to marry her stepsister. But when the bride's mother heard the groom was a disgraced, bankrupt syndicate boss with nothing left but a ruined reputation and enemies at every door, she yanked her precious Savannah out of that wedding dress and shoved her stepdaughter into it instead. The girl no one wanted. The girl who owed this family everything, or so they kept telling her. Arya walked down that aisle in a dress that did not fit, toward a stranger whose neck was covered in dark, sweeping tattoos that curled up toward his jaw like a warning written in ink. But when the vows were done and the chapel fell silent, the groom leaned close, so close his jaw grazed her cheek, and whispered 4 words that stopped her heart cold. "Good thing they switched you. Now you are mine." Welcome to the channel. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss an update. The morning of the wedding arrived, wrapped in the particular kind of silence that only exists when a house is holding its breath. Arya stood in front of the narrow mirror, propped against the wall of the spare room she had been given, not a bedroom, never truly hers, pressing her fingertips against the fabric of a dress that smelled faintly of Savannah's perfume. It was ivory satin with an elaborate lace overlay, ordered from a boutique in the city 3 months ago, fitted to her stepsister's measurements with meticulous care. On Savannah, it would have been breathtaking. On Arya, the shoulders pulled, the waist gaped, and the hem skimmed an inch too long, as though the gown itself understood she was never supposed to be the one wearing it. Downstairs, her stepmother's voice carried through the floorboards like smoke under a closed door. "I will not allow Savannah to throw her life away on a man who is nothing." Beatrice's tone was smooth, deliberate, the kind of voice that had learned long ago how to make cruelty sound like wisdom. Marcus from the Syndicate Council confirmed it himself. Matteo Rivers lost everything, his empire, his assets, his standing. The man is finished. He has dangerous enemies and not a single ally left worth nomming. A pause, then quieter. Arya will go. She has no prospects, no future she's building toward anything real. This is the most useful thing she has ever done for this family. Arya closed her eyes. Useful. That was the word Beatrice always returned to, the one she wielded most efficiently. Arya had been useful at 16 when her father died and left her with nothing. Useful for cooking, for cleaning, for taking up the least possible space while Savannah flourished in every room Arya was not allowed to fully enter. She had been useful when the family needed someone to blame, someone to sideline, someone to absorb every inconvenience so that Savannah's life could remain smooth and uninterrupted. And now she was useful here, too, sacrificed to a supposedly broken man so that the favored daughter would not have to be. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, feeling the cool metal of the pendant her mother had left her, a small crescent moon, silver-edged and old, kept polished by years of her careful attention, the one small ritual she never skipped. Her mother, Clara, had died when Arya was very small. Beatrice had come later, efficient and absolute, filling every corner of the house with her preferences until Arya's own had no room left to breathe. There were no photographs of Clara that Beatrice had not managed to misplace. No letters, only this pendant resting against Arya's skin, the one piece of Clara's life that Beatrice had never managed to take. Her father had told her once, in the careful way of a man who did not fully understand what he was saying, that Clara had come from old money, a family with connections that went back further than their small town's memory, people with influence, with reach, with the kind of history that was kept quiet on purpose. He had said it like a bedtime story, soft and distant. Arya had held onto it like a lifeline. Last night, Beatrice had stood in the doorway of this room with her arms crossed, and her expression arranged into something that almost resembled practicality. "You are 24 years old, Arya," she had said. "You work at a florist's shop and you have nothing saved, nothing built, and no one waiting for you. Matteo Rivers may be a ruined man, but he can still give you a roof. You should be grateful this opportunity exists at all." Arya had wanted to correct her. She had been saving carefully, quietly, planning toward something Beatrice had never once asked about because she had never once treated Arya's interior life as relevant. She had dreams she kept in a notebook under the floorboard near the window, small and specific and entirely her own. But she had learned what happened when she argued. The walls in this house were made of ice, and Beatrice was their architect. So she had agreed, not from gratitude, not from obedience. Because something inexplicable had moved through her chest the moment Beatrice said Matteo Rivers' name, an undeniable pull she could not account for. A feeling, low and certain, like a compass needle swinging toward north with sudden, absolute confidence. She had told herself it was anxiety. She had told herself it was the adrenaline of the impossible situation pressing in around her. She was not sure she believed that. Now, standing in the dress that did not belong to her, Arya lifted her chin and looked at herself in the mirror. Wide, dark eyes. Pearl drop earrings she had borrowed from the small jewelry box in Savannah's room because Beatrice had thrust them at her and said you need to look convincing. The lace veil pinned carefully to her dark hair. She looked like a woman walking into something she had not chosen. But underneath that, underneath the borrowed dress and the imposed veil and the weight of every year she had spent being this family's afterthought, something else looked back at her from the mirror. Something quiet and steady and entirely, unmistakably hers. She pressed 2 fingers against the crescent moon at her throat. I hope you are watching, Mama, she thought. I hope whatever you left in me is enough for wherever I am going. The chapel sat at the far end of the old avenue, where the city's polished edges gave way to older stone and iron gates, and the particular gravity of a building that had witnessed too many promises to be impressed by any of them. And for one suspended moment the only sound in the world was the soft drag of ivory satin against ancient stone floor. She walked. That was all she could think to do. Left foot, then right. Don't stop. Don't look at the faces lining the pews, strangers, all of them, men in dark suits with the particular stillness of people who had learned long ago how to watch without revealing anything. She counted the candles instead. The amber clusters burning in iron stands along the aisle. The way the light fractured against the high vaulted ceiling and fell back down in pieces. Beatrice had given her exactly one instruction before the doors opened. Don't embarrass this family. As though this were something Arya was doing to them. The dress pulled across her shoulders with every step, the lace veil catching the faint draft that moved through the chapel like a living thing. She had not eaten that morning. Her hands, wrapped around a small bouquet of white flowers she had not chosen, were ice cold, and she could feel her pulse in her fingertips, frantic and too loud, as if her own body was trying to warn her. She did not let herself look at the altar. Not yet. If she looked too soon and lost her nerve, her legs would stop working and she would stand here in the middle of this candle-lit aisle, in a dead woman's dress, in front of a room full of strangers, and she would simply cease to be able to continue. So she watched the floor instead. The worn stone, polished by decades of footsteps, the edge of her hem skimming across it. 30 feet. 20. Then someone in her peripheral vision shifted, and she felt it before she understood it. A change in the quality of the air near the altar, a density, a gravity that had not been there a moment before. The pull at the center of her chest, the same inexplicable feeling she had felt the night Beatrice first said his name, surged suddenly and without warning, rolling through her like the first note of a song she didn't know she'd been waiting to hear. She looked up. He was already looking at her. Matteo Rivers stood at the altar with the kind of stillness that did not come from patience, but from absolute, cellular certainty, the stillness of something that has never once doubted its own nature. He was taller than she had expected, dark-suited, devastatingly composed. But it was his neck that stopped the breath in her throat. The tattoos she had glimpsed from the chapel entrance were even more arresting up close, dark, sweeping lines that curled from beneath his collar in deliberate, intricate patterns, rising toward his jaw like a language written in ink by someone who had intended it to be read. They were not reckless. They were a map, a history, something declared rather than decorated. His face was sharp-boned and unreadable, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been decided upon firmly and without compromise. Dark hair. Eyes that caught the candlelight and did something complicated with it, something that turned Amber to something older and more dangerous. Those eyes were on her, only her. Not with surprise, not with the faint disappointment she had braced for, the subtle recalibration of a man who had been expecting Savannah and received instead the spare, the overlooked, the one nobody had ever looked at twice. There was none of that. What she found instead, when she finally met his gaze fully and her footsteps brought her to the last few feet of distance between them, was recognition. Quiet, absolute, and terrifying in its certainty. As though he had been waiting. As though this, her, specifically, in this ill-fitting dress with her cold hands and her pounding pulse, was precisely the outcome he had arranged. She took her place beside him. The efficient began to speak. The words moved over her like water over stone, present but not penetrating, because every nerve in her body was acutely, helplessly aware of the man standing 6 inches to her left. She could feel the warmth radiating from him. Could feel, beneath the fear layered thick across her chest, that inexplicable pull strengthening with his proximity into something almost gravitational, something that made her pulse race and her breath thin until both were nearly impossible to ignore. She said the words she was prompted to say. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. He said his with the unhurried ease of a man, signing a document he had already read in full. And then it was done. The silence that followed the final word was enormous. The kind of silence that only exists in old stone buildings full of people holding very still. Matteo turned toward her. He did not rush. He moved with the same absolute, contained deliberateness that seemed to govern everything about him, and when he leaned in, it was not the tentative inclination of a stranger observing ceremony. It was the movement of someone closing the last inch of a distance he had decided, long before today, to eliminate. His jaw grazed her cheek. She felt the slight rasp of it against her skin and forgot, for one complete second, how to breathe. His voice came low and private and devastatingly calm, shaped for her ear alone, inaudible to every dark-suited stranger in every candle-lit pew. Good thing they switched you. A beat, one slow, deliberate breath. Now you're mine. Arya stared straight ahead at the candles burning in their iron stands, at the old walls holding all that amber light, at the life she had known dissolving silently behind her. Her hands had stopped shaking. She did not understand why. No one told her where they were going. A black car had been waiting at the chapel's side entrance, long, armored in the way that only became apparent when you noticed how the doors closed with that particular weighted finality, like a vault sealing rather than a latch catching. 2 men in dark suits stood flanking it, and they did not look like drivers. They looked like a decision someone had already made on her behalf. Matteo's hand had come to the small of her back as they left the chapel, light enough to be called courteous, firm enough to be called something else entirely. She had felt it through the layers of satin and lace like a brand. He had said nothing. She had said nothing. The guests, those still, watchful men in their dark suits, had parted for them without being asked. Now the city gave way outside the tinted windows, its familiar edges dissolving into wider roads, then gates, then a long private drive lined with old-growth trees that pressed close on both sides like a corridor that had opinions about who it admitted. The last of the afternoon light came through the branches in broken pieces, and Arya watched it and pressed her cold hands flat against her thighs and told herself to keep breathing. The estate materialized through the trees without warning. She had expected large. She had not expected this. It rose from the grounds with the quiet authority of something that had never needed to announce itself, stone and dark glass and architecture, that somehow managed to be both fortress and home, both beautiful and absolute. Floodlights were already warming against the dusk, illuminating manicured grounds that stretched in every direction with a scale that made her chest tighten. Security cameras tracked their approach with the patient, mechanical attention of things that never blinked. At the outer perimeter, 2 guards acknowledged the car with a nod that was less greeting than confirmation. Yes, we see you. Yes, you are expected. Yes, everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Arya counted 3 separate gates before they reached the entrance. She thought of Beatrice's voice through the floorboards that morning. He is bankrupt. He inherited nothing but debt. No daughter of mine will suffer that fate. She looked at the fountain centered in the courtyard, water moving in the early evening air, lit from beneath in pale gold. She looked at the stone steps, the iron-banded doors, the sheer unambiguous permanence of everything her eyes could reach. Something cold and clarifying moved through her. This was not the estate of a ruined man. This was not even close. Inside, the scale continued without apology. High ceilings, floors that absorbed sound and returned it differently, quieter and more deliberate. Art on the walls that she did not have the vocabulary to properly assess but understood instinctively. Was not decorative, it was declarative. Staff moved at the periphery of each room they passed through, efficient and unobtrusive, the kind of household that had been running smoothly long before today and would continue long after. A woman showed her to a room on the upper floor. "Your room," she said, and the phrasing snagged in Arya's mind like a thread catching on something sharp. Not a room. Your room. As though this had been designated before today. As though the decision of her presence here had not been made this morning in crisis, but considerably earlier, by someone with the luxury of patience. When the woman left, Arya stood in the center of the room and looked at it carefully. The wardrobe was already stocked. Not Savannah's taste, not the bright, attention-seeking palette her stepsister favored. These were clothes in Arya's colors, the muted and the rich, the kind of fabric she pressed her fingers against in shop windows and kept walking. The shelves held books, specific books, titles she had mentioned in passing to no one she could remember, or had perhaps only ever thought about wanting to read. On the vanity, a small crescent moon pendant sat in an open dish, silver-edged and old, so similar to her mother's that her breath left her body for the second time that day. She picked it up with unsteady hands. Her mind, which had been moving in controlled, careful steps since the chapel, stopped pretending to be calm and simply went very, very still. The rumors, the manufactured disgrace, bankrupt, dangerous, finished, words that had moved through the right channels at exactly the right moment to reach Beatrice, to horrify her, to make her do the one thing she always did when presented with risk, protect Savannah and spend Arya instead. But Beatrice had not been the architect of this morning. She had only believed she was. Someone else had been holding that particular pen. "You have questions." Matteo's voice came from the doorway. She had not heard him approach, another thing to file quietly away, that a man of his size moved through space without announcing himself. He leaned against the doorframe with his jacket removed now, shirt sleeves turned back, the tattoos visible past his collar and down the side of his throat, and he watched her with those eyes that did complicated things with available light. She turned to face him fully. The pendant was still in her hand. "The rumors," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "You made them." He did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "I needed your stepmother to make a specific choice. You needed her to sacrifice me instead of Savannah." "I needed her," he said, with the precision of a man selecting his words the way others selected weapons, "to send me you." Something in her chest shifted, a slow, certain feeling she could not name and did not try to. Arya looked at the room that had been prepared for her, at the books, the colors, the small silver moon, at a life arranged around her specific shape by hands she had not known were reaching. "And if I had refused to walk down that aisle?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something older than a smile. "You were always going to walk down that aisle, Arya." She wanted to argue. She found, with a frustration that was not entirely unpleasant, that she could not. If you're tired of people who only value what something costs instead of what it's worth, hit that like button and comment, character over cash, because Savannah will never understand what she lost today. She did not sleep well. Bed was the most comfortable thing she had ever lain in, deep and wide, and draped in linen that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something clean and grounding she could not name, and still she lay awake in it for hours, watching the ceiling and listening to the estate breathe around her. It was not an uncomfortable sound. That was the unsettling part. The low movement of the house, the distant exchange of voices somewhere below, the occasional footstep in the corridor, none of it felt threatening. It felt, with a persistence she found deeply inconvenient, like the sounds of somewhere she belonged. She was up before dawn. The wardrobe yielded a dark sweater and fitted trousers in her size, in her colors, with the same quiet precision that everything in this room had demonstrated since her arrival. She dressed quickly, tucked her mother's pendant beneath the neckline, and slipped out into the corridor with the vague and unexamined intention of finding coffee and a room where no one would ask her how she was adjusting. She found neither. What she found instead was the lower floor already fully inhabited. The main room off the grand staircase, wide, high-ceilinged, its tall windows beginning to pale with the first gray suggestion of morning, contained 4 men arranged with the casual, weight-bearing ease of people who gathered in this space regularly and considered it their own. They were not loud. They were the opposite of loud, in the way that certain kinds of power tend to be, comfortable enough in itself to have nothing to prove. Conversation stopped when she appeared at the base of the stairs. 8 eyes found her with varying degrees of assessment, and the room did the particular thing that rooms do when they are deciding what to make of something unexpected. Matteo stood at the far end near the window, a coffee cup in his hand, already dressed as though the concept of morning held no dominion over him. He looked at her arrival with that same quality of unsurprise that was beginning to feel less like composure and more like foreknowledge. "Gentlemen," he said, and it was less an introduction than a signal. The man closest to her stood first. He was broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, with a scar running pale and clean through his left brow that he wore the way other men wore watches, habitually and without apology. His expression, unlike the others, was not assessing. It was something closer to quietly, privately satisfied, as though her presence confirmed something he had been told to expect and had chosen to believe only upon seeing. "Dominic Reyes," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm and brief and entirely respectful. "I run operations for Matteo, and I have been told a great deal about you, Mrs. Rivers." The name landed strangely, not badly, strangely. "I haven't been told anything about any of you," she said, because it was true, and because she had decided somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floor last night that she was finished performing smaller than she was. Dominic's mouth curved. "That's fair." He gestured to the others in turn, Ezra, lean and watchful with the eyes of someone who catalogued everything and discarded nothing. Felix, younger, with an open face that did not quite hide the sharpness operating behind it. And Luca, silver-templed and unhurried, the kind of man who had long ago made peace with the weight he carried and found it agreeable. They were not identical in type, but they shared something beneath the surface. A loyalty so thoroughly settled into their bones it had stopped being a choice and become simply a characteristic, like eye color. The kind of trust that was built in blood and silence, earned across years that none of them would ever need to speak about because they had all been present for them. Coffee was produced. She was given a seat at the table not as a guest but as a fixture, which was its own kind of statement. The conversation resumed around her, practical and clipped, territory, schedules, something about the eastern perimeter that needed addressing by Thursday, and no one explained it to her or apologized for its opacity, which she found, unexpectedly, more respectful than exclusion would have been. They were not hiding things from her. They were simply continuing. It was Matteo who drew her away from the table an hour later, with a slight inclination of his head toward the corridor that led to the estate's eastern wing. She followed him into a quieter room, a study, floor to ceiling with books and maps, and the organized density of a mind that consumed information the way other things consumed air. He poured her a second coffee without asking, set it on the edge of the desk nearest her. "How long?" she asked. She had been building toward it since the wardrobe, since the books with her specific titles, since the pendant in the dish. "How long have you been watching me?" He considered the question with that particular stillness of his, the kind that was not hesitation but deliberation. 3 years, he said, "since the night your stepmother removed you from the guest list of your own father's memorial." The air went out of the room. She remembered that night. The phone call from Beatrice, clipped and unapologetic. "It's a small gathering, Arya, family." as though she were not her father's blood, as though grief were a resource to be rationed and she did not qualify. "I had people looking after you," Matteo said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, something that cost him slightly more than his usual economy of expression. "Making sure you were safe, that you had what you needed." "You could have simply," she began. "No," he said it without harshness. "The timing had to be right. You were not ready to walk into this world without understanding what it would ask of you, and I needed to be certain, completely certain, before I brought you into it." His eyes held hers with that steady, disquieting directness. "I do not make mistakes with things that matter, Arya." She looked at him across the study, this man with his maps and his tattoos and his 3 years of silent, unasked-for guardianship, and felt her hand drift to the pendant at her throat, her fingers closing around it tightly, the metal warm from her own skin. She was not sure if she was furious. She was not sure if she was not. The call came on a Thursday. 4 days into her new life, if life was even the right word for what this was, this slow and careful process of learning the dimensions of an existence she had not chosen and was beginning, with great reluctance and greater honesty, to find she did not entirely want to leave. 4 days of quiet mornings in the study with books she had always meant to read. 4 days of dinners at a table where no one reminded her to be grateful for her portion. 4 days of Dominic briefing her without condescension on the estate's rhythms, of Felix teaching her the security codes with the patient ease of someone who had already decided she was permanent, of Matteo watching her from across rooms with that steady, unreadable attention that made her pulse quicken, and her thoughts go sideways in directions she was not ready to examine. 4 days of being, against every expectation she had brought with her, something close to comfortable. She was in the garden when her phone rang. The estate's eastern grounds opened into a wide, stone-edged space where something old had been planted long before the current architecture and allowed to grow according to its own judgment. Lavender in long corridors, dark climbing roses against the far wall, a single ancient oak near the center that looked like it had been making decisions about this land since before anyone thought to build on it. She had found it on her second morning and returned to it each day since, drawn by the particular quality of silence it offered, layered and alive rather than empty. She looked at the screen. Beatrice. She almost let it ring out. Something, old habit, the deeply conditioned reflex of a woman who had spent years treating conflict avoidance as a survival strategy, made her answer instead. "Arya." Beatrice's voice came through the line with its familiar texture, smooth and deliberate on the surface and cold beneath in the way of rivers that look calm before the drop. But there was something else in it today. Something Arya needed a moment to identify because she had never heard it there before. Strain, genuine, poorly concealed strain. "Beatrice," Arya said. A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be intentional. "I am going to speak plainly." She always said this before saying something she had calculated very carefully. "All right. I have made some inquiries." Another pause, the kind that wanted to be dramatic but was actually just frightened. About Matteo Rivers." Arya said nothing. She looked at the oak tree. "It appears," Beatrice continued, each word arriving with the stiffness of something being forced through a passage too narrow for it, "that the information I received about his financial situation was not accurate. It appears that he is," a brief, almost imperceptible stop, "considerably more successful than I was led to believe." Considerably. The estate's 3 perimeter gates, the staff who moved like a well-rehearsed ensemble, the art on the walls that declared rather than decorated, the grounds that stretched in every direction with the quiet confidence of land that had never once worried about its own continuation. Considerably was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "I see," Arya said. "This changes things." Beatrice's voice found firmer ground now, recognizing the terrain of negotiation, which was the landscape she had always navigated most confidently. "You must understand that had I known the true nature of his circumstances, I would never have, the arrangement would have been structured very differently. Savannah is the elder. Savannah has always been the one who." "Savannah," Arya said quietly, refused to walk down that aisle. She was misinformed. We were both misinformed. That is precisely my point. The strain was sharpening now into something more familiar, the particular edge Beatrice's voice acquired when she had decided what she wanted and was moving toward it with the focused efficiency of someone who had never significantly been told no. An annulment is entirely possible at this stage. These things can be arranged discreetly, with minimal disruption to everyone involved. Matteo Rivers is a powerful man. I am sure he would understand the situation if it were explained correctly. Savannah is beautiful, accomplished. She would make a far more suitable. Beatrice. The name stopped her. Perhaps because of how it came out, not loudly, not with the ragged edge of old hurt or the careful modulation of someone trying to hold themselves together. Quietly, firmly, with the particular quality of a door being closed by someone who has decided, finally, that they live on the other side of it. I want you to hear me, Arya said. Not as someone you can redirect, actually hear me. Silence on the line. The oak tree moved faintly in the morning air. I spent 24 years in that house being useful, being managed, being the variable you adjusted whenever Savannah's equation needed balancing. You sent me to marry a man you believed was dangerous and broken because I was the one you could afford to lose. She paused, and the pause was not for effect, but because she needed a moment to ensure the next words came from the right place, not from the girl who had pressed her palms against borrowed satin in a spare room mirror, but from whoever that girl was becoming inside these walls, in this garden, at this table where no one counted her portions. You did not send me here as a gift. You sent me here as a sacrifice. And I want you to sit with the fact that the sacrifice landed somewhere you will spend a very long time wishing you had not discarded. Beatrice's inhale was sharp and small. Arya, I understand you are emotional. I'm not emotional, she said. I'm clear. There will be no annulment. There will be no arrangement. Savannah will not be taking anything from me, not this time, not any time. Her hand had found the pendant at her throat without her instructing it to, her fingers closing around the small silver crescent and holding tight. Don't call this number again unless you have something worth saying. She ended the call. The garden held its silence around her. The lavender moved. The old oak stood in its steady, centuries, deep patience, and Arya stood beneath it with her heart knocking hard against her ribs and something else moving through her chest alongside it, something expansive and unfamiliar and clean, like a window opened in a room that had been sealed for years. She did not hear Matteo approach. She was beginning to accept that she never would. That was Beatrice, she said without turning. It was not a question. I know. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, which she was learning was characteristic. He positioned himself alongside rather than opposite, a subtle but consistent thing that she had begun to notice and could not entirely account for. She found out. Arya turned the phone over in her hand. About the money, about everything. She was always going to find out. And you're not concerned. She looked at him then. The morning light was doing something particular to the tattoos at his throat, tracing the dark lines with gold, and she made herself focus on his eyes instead because focusing on his eyes was only marginally less destabilizing. About Beatrice? Something moved in his expression, not dismissal exactly, but the specific unconcern of a man who has already mapped every possible move on a board his opponent doesn't know they're playing on. No. She'll push. She won't simply accept. I know what she'll do. He said it with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, and then he said, more carefully, what I want to know is what you did. Arya looked back at the oak, at the lavender corridors, at the garden that had somehow, in 4 days, begun to feel like hers. I hung up on her, she said. The silence that followed was warm. Good, Matteo said. Just that. Just the one word, low and unhurried and carrying in it something that felt, beneath its simplicity, like the first acknowledgement she had ever received from anyone that the space she occupied was not contingent on her continued usefulness to someone else. She pressed her fingers against the crescent moon and felt the metal warm from her grip, steady against her skin. For the first time in 24 years, She did not feel like something that could be redirected. If manipulative people who try to claim credit for other people's happiness make your blood boil, smash that subscribe button and comment. No second chances for toxic people. Because Beatrice just made the most expensive mistake of her life. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon without warning, which told Arya everything about how seriously Beatrice had taken her instruction not to call again. She heard the commotion from the upper hallway, voices at the main gate, one of them carrying the particular high, aggrieved pitch that Savannah deployed whenever she encountered resistance she considered beneath her, and she knew before she reached the top of the staircase. She knew in the way she had always known Beatrice's moods from the quality of footsteps on floorboards, the way a person learns to read weather not from forecasts, but from the specific pressure in their own bones. She looked over the balustrade. Through the tall front windows, she could see the gate's intercom light blinking, and Dominic standing in the entrance hall below with his phone already in his hand, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man deciding between several options and selecting the most efficient one. He looked up and found her eyes. "Your family is at the gate," he said, with a neutrality so complete it was almost its own editorial. "I know," she said. "Don't let them in." "Already decided," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "Matteo's been notified." She came downstairs anyway. She did not entirely know why. Something in her had shifted in the 4 days since the phone call, since the garden, since the word good delivered in a quiet voice that had landed in her chest and taken up residence there. She was not going to hide in her room while Beatrice performed outrage at the perimeter of a life she had discarded and now wanted back. She was going to stand in her own entrance hall, and she was going to watch. Through the security feed on the hallway panel, she could see them. Beatrice in a cream blazer, hair immaculate, the expression on her face one Arya recognized as her public-facing fury, controlled, presentable, the kind designed to read as righteousness rather than desperation. Savannah stood slightly behind her, beautiful in the specific, effortful way she had always been beautiful, wearing an expression that oscillated between genuine grievance and the faint uncertainty of someone who had been told a version of events, and was only now, at the gate of this estate, beginning to sense the scale of what she had actually walked away from. The intercom crackled. Beatrice's voice came through, stripped of the velvet she usually wrapped it in. "I would like to speak with my daughter. Immediately. I know she's in there and I am not leaving until—" "Mrs. Holloway," Matteo's voice from somewhere behind Arya. She turned. He had come from the eastern corridor, still in the dark shirt he'd been wearing in the study that morning, unhurried, the tattoos at his throat catching the afternoon light through the hall windows. He looked at the security feed with the expression of a man examining something mildly interesting rather than problematic. Then he looked at Arya. Something passed between them in that look, a question, and her answer to it without either of them using words. He moved to the panel and pressed the gate release himself. "Let them come in," he said, to Dominic rather than anyone else. "I'd like to have this conversation properly." Dominic's brow lifted by approximately 2 millimeters. He pressed the gate. They waited. The sound of heels on the stone drive preceded them through the door. Beatrice's stride, Arya had always thought, was designed to announce arrival before it occurred. And then they were in the entrance hall, and Beatrice's carefully maintained expression underwent a brief, involuntary recalibration as the full interior of the estate resolved around her. She had been prepared, Arya could tell, for something impressive. She had not been prepared for this. No one was on first encounter. The scale of the place did something to people's assumptions. It quietly dismantled them and left the person holding the pieces. Savannah said nothing. She was looking at the ceiling. Beatrice recovered in approximately 4 seconds, which was genuinely impressive and said a great deal about the architecture of her ego. Her eyes found Arya first, moved over her with the familiar assessing quality that Arya had spent 2 decades learning to make herself small against, and then moved to Matteo. They stayed there. "Mr. Rivers," she said, recalibrated, recomposed, already repositioning. "I appreciate you allowing us in. I think if we speak rationally, adult to adult, we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone." I agree, Matteo said pleasantly. He gestured toward the main reception room. Shall we? Arya almost said something. The pleasantness was new, or not new exactly, but deployed at a register she hadn't heard before, the particular even-toned graciousness of a man who has decided exactly what this conversation is going to be and is simply providing it a comfortable place to occur. They sat, or Beatrice and Savannah sat. Arya and Matteo remained standing, which was not something she had coordinated but which felt, once it happened, entirely correct. Beatrice opened. She had clearly prepared. She spoke about the confusion surrounding the original arrangement, about Savannah's suitability, about the nature of the match and what it had been intended to accomplish for both families. She used the word practical 4 times. She used the word appropriate 3 times. She did not once use the word mistake, but it lived inside every sentence she constructed, banging quietly against the walls of her careful syntax. Savannah, for her part, said very little. She was looking at the room, at the art, at the particular quality of light through the tall windows, and she had the grace, or perhaps simply the self-awareness, to look not triumphant but uncertain, as though the script she had been handed on the drive here was not performing the way she had been told it would. Matteo let Beatrice finish. The silence that followed her conclusion was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that a very specific kind of person uses the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, and with clear intent about what it is going to open. I want to make sure I understand you correctly, he said. His voice was the same register it always was, unhurried, absolute. You placed Arya in a situation you believed to be dangerous and financially ruinous because you considered her expendable. You made that calculation openly, without hesitation, and sent her to marry a man you had been told was broken and potentially violent, because the well-being of your biological daughter was worth protecting and hers was not. He paused. And now that the calculation has resolved differently than you anticipated, you would like to reverse it. Beatrice opened her mouth. I'm not finished. He said it without raising his voice, and she closed her mouth, which told Arya more about the quality of Matteo's authority than anything she had witnessed in the preceding week. Arya is my wife. She is not a variable in your family's financial planning. She is not a contingency. She is not something you are owed access to because you spent 2 decades making her feel as though she owed you her existence. The tattoos at his throat moved with the line of his jaw as he held Beatrice's gaze with the steady, unblinking patience of something that has decided it will simply outlast whatever is in front of it. You do not have a claim here. You have never had a claim on her. And I want to be very precise with you now, because I think imprecision is what has allowed you to operate this way for as long as you have. The room was very quiet. Even the lights seemed to be paying attention. If you attempt to contact Arya without her explicit invitation, I will make it my personal interest to ensure that every professional and legal vulnerability your family has accumulated over the years becomes someone else's explicit interest as well. If you send anyone to this estate uninvited again, the gate will not open. And if you ever again speak about my wife as though she is something to be reassigned, he stopped. Let the stop do its work. I would encourage you very strongly not to do that. Savannah stood up first. Her face had gone the particular pale of someone who has understood, belatedly and completely, the size of what she walked away from, and understood also that it was not the estate or the money or the scale of any of this, but the specific and irreplaceable thing she had not recognized as valuable because no one had ever taught her that it was. She looked at Arya, and for one brief, unguarded moment her expression held something that was almost regret. Arya looked back at her calmly. She did not fill the silence. Beatrice left without another word, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing she had ever said. When the door closed, Dominic appeared from the corridor with the timing of a man who had been listening from a comfortable distance and had enjoyed himself. Matteo turned to Arya. The pleasantness had resolved back into his usual expression, steady, direct, the faint warmth that lived behind the stillness and only became visible if you had spent enough days learning where to look. Are you all right? He asked. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I think, she said slowly, that I have never been more all right in my life. Her fingers rested against the pendant at her throat, warm from being held. The estate settled quietly around them, solid and permanent and entirely, completely hers. If you love seeing a narcissist finally face the room they cannot charm their way out of, hit that like button and comment. Everyone deserves respect. Because what Matteo just did is what we all deserved someone to do for us. The memories came back that night. Not dreams, she wanted to be precise about that, because she had experienced enough of those in her life to know the difference. These were something else entirely. Something with weight and warmth and a texture that felt less like imagination and more like retrieval, as though her sleeping mind was not inventing but recovering, pulling things up from somewhere deep and long submerged the way the tide pulls objects from the ocean floor when the conditions finally change. In the first memory, she was very small. Standing in a kitchen she did not recognize, warm yellow light and the smell of bread baking and something herbal, something green and alive she could not name. And her mother was there. She knew it was her mother before she saw her face, knew it with a certainty that required no evidence and no photographs, because the body remembers what the mind is too young to hold. Clara. Bending down to her level, dark hair loose and long, eyes that were warm and serious, and carrying in them the particular weight of a woman who was keeping something important very carefully contained. She was more real than anything Arya had been given language to expect. Not the ghost Beatrice had made of her, not the absence, the misplaced photographs, the deliberate erasure. A woman. A full, specific, present woman whose hands smelled of flour and whose voice, when she spoke, had a cadence Arya recognized the way a person recognizes their own heartbeat when it suddenly becomes audible. She was saying something about being careful, about keeping certain things quiet, about people who would come looking if they knew. Then the memory dissolved, and the estate's early morning settled around her, and she lay in the dark with the pendant gripped in her fist and the absolute, bone-certain knowledge that what she had seen was not nothing. It happened again the second night, closer this time, more detailed, the kitchen resolving into a specific place, a house she could almost locate, a conversation she could almost follow. Clara's voice carrying that same careful weight, and underneath it a tone Arya was only now old enough to identify. Fear. The particular, controlled fear of a woman who has built a life on top of a secret and can feel the ground beginning to shift. By the third morning, she was sitting in the study when Matteo arrived at his customary early hour, and she did not wait for coffee or for the comfortable establishment of the day's ordinary rhythm. She simply looked at him from across the room and said, "Tell me about my mother." He was still in the doorway. Something in his expression moved, not surprise, but the particular quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and finds, now that it has arrived, that the waiting was the easier part. He came in. He did not sit behind the desk, which was where he usually positioned himself in this room. He took the chair across from hers, which put them level, which she understood was deliberate. "What did you remember?" he asked. She told him, all of it, the kitchen, the yellow light, Clara's voice carrying words about being careful, about people who would come looking. She watched his face as she spoke and saw in it a confirmation that settled into her chest like a stone, finding the bottom of still water. "Clara Voss," he said when she finished, and the way he said it with the particular care of a name that means more than its syllables made her sit very still. She was the only daughter of the Voss family. Old money, old influence, old danger, the kind of crime family that doesn't appear in newspapers because they own the newspapers. They operated out of the eastern seaboard for 3 generations, controlling ports, shipping routes, financial networks that most law enforcement didn't even know existed. He paused. She ran from that world when she was 22, changed her name, buried every connection, married your father, who was a good man and an ordinary one, and she built a life designed to be invisible to the people she had left behind. Arya's hand had found the pendant. She was hiding. "She was protecting you," Matteo said. "The Voss family's assets, their networks, their influence, a significant portion of it was tied to Clara's bloodline. When she disappeared, the family fractured. Certain interests went dormant. Certain accounts were sealed under inheritance clauses that only a direct descendant could unlock." His voice was careful and without judgment. When she died, those clauses didn't expire. They transferred to you. And Beatrice knows this. Beatrice has known since before she married your father. The words landed with the weight of something he had been holding carefully, waiting for the right moment to set down. She found documentation in your father's belongings, letters Clara had hidden, account references, enough to understand that Arya Voss's daughter was sitting on a legacy worth more than Beatrice could accumulate in 10 lifetimes. She has spent the last 8 years quietly positioning herself to access it, keeping you small, keeping you dependent, keeping you ignorant of what your mother left you. The air went out of the room for the second time in a week. She thought of the spare room that was never truly hers, the florist's shop, the 24 years of useful. Every time Beatrice had told her she had nothing, owned nothing, was building toward nothing, not observations but architecture. A cage built one bar at a time from the specific lie that she was worthless, designed to keep her exactly where Beatrice needed her, controllable, grateful, and completely unaware of what she was owed. "How did you find this?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was distantly impressed by that. 3 years ago, when I first learned about you, I had my people look into your background. Standard due diligence, your father's finances, your family history, anything that might be relevant. He held her gaze. What they found was not standard. The Voss name triggered flags and networks that go back decades. I spent 18 months verifying it, cross-referencing Clara's movements, confirming the inheritance structures. A pause. "You are not the stepdaughter of a woman who did you a favor by keeping you fed, Arya. You are the sole heir to one of the most significant hidden fortunes on the eastern seaboard. And every person who has ever told you that you had nothing was either ignorant or lying." She sat with that, sat with the full, unambiguous weight of it, the manufactured poverty, the calculated dependence, the stepmother who had kept her small not out of indifference but out of strategy. A woman who had married Arya's father not for love, but for proximity to a secret she had been mining ever since. "The pendant," she said slowly, looking down at the crescent moon in her hand. Clara's pendant, kept and polished and held close for 20 years. It was Clara's, one of the few things she kept from her old life. Matteo's voice was quiet. "I had a matching one made when I prepared this room for you. I wanted you to know that someone understood what it meant." She looked at the pendant on the vanity, the second crescent moon, the one she had found on her first night here. 2 moons, one from the mother who had hidden a world to protect her, one from the man who had uncovered it to bring her home. "And the marriage," she said, because it was the last question, and she had decided somewhere in the last 3 days of recovered memories that she was finished leaving important things unasked. Was this about the inheritance, about accessing what Clara left? Matteo looked at her for a long moment. In the morning light, his face was very open, which was unusual. She had learned that openness cost him something, that he spent most of his existence behind a composure so complete it had its own texture. This was different. This was the face beneath the composure, the face that existed when there was no longer any strategic reason to conceal it. "No," he said, simply, completely. "The inheritance is yours. Every cent, every asset, every sealed account, it belongs to you and has always belonged to you, and I have no intention of touching it. My lawyers have already begun the process of transferring full legal control to you directly." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, assembling, the way a person assembles something they have not had occasion to say in full before. "Because 3 years ago I watched a woman get excluded from her own father's memorial by a person who was supposed to protect her, and something in my gut told me with a certainty I have never felt about anything in my life, and I have built an empire on the strength of my instincts, that she was mine to protect, not to own, not to control. To protect and to stand beside, and to ensure that no one ever again made her feel like she was the lesser option." His eyes did not waver. "The pull I felt when I found you was not strategic, Arya. It was not about legacy or assets or positioning. It was the most undeniable thing I have ever experienced. And everything I have done since, the rumors, the arrangement, this room, these walls, has been in service of getting you here, where you belong." Something resolved in her chest, slow and certain and warm, like a lock turning, like a compass finding true north after years of spinning. She felt it settle into her the way certainty settles, not with drama but with weight, permanent and quiet and entirely real. She looked at him across the study, this man with his maps and his tattoos and his 3 years of patient, unasked for guardianship, and felt for the first time the full shape of what had been building between them since the altar, not a transaction, not an arrangement, but something that ran deeper than either of those words could hold. An undeniable connection that she had been feeling since the moment she heard his name, that had only grown stronger with proximity, with honesty, with every day she spent learning the specific ways he moved through the world and finding them, against all expectation, entirely compatible with her own. "Tell me everything," she said, "about the Voss family, about the inheritance, about whatever Beatrice has been doing with it. Leave nothing out." He held her gaze, and for the first time since the altar, he smiled. Not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth suggestion of one. A full, rare, completely unguarded smile that transformed his face into something that stole the breath clean from her body. And then he began. "If you believe everyone deserves to know the truth about who they are, no matter how long someone tried to bury it, subscribe now and comment. The truth always surfaces. Because Arya just discovered that the people who called her worthless were standing on top of everything she owned." The ambush came on a Thursday. 2 weeks into her new life, if life was even the right word for what this was, this slow and deliberate process of learning the dimensions of an existence she had not chosen and was beginning, with great reluctance and greater honesty, to recognize as her own. 2 weeks of quiet mornings in the study while Matteo's lawyers dismantled, piece by careful piece, the legal architecture Beatrice had spent 8 years constructing around the Voss inheritance. 2 weeks of dinners at a long table where conversation moved in the clipped, efficient rhythms of people managing territory and risk, and where her presence had shifted, by degrees so subtle she almost missed them, from guest to fixture, to something the men around that table simply factored into their planning the way they factored in walls and weather, as a permanent condition of the environment. 2 weeks of Matteo, of learning the geography of a man who revealed himself in inches rather than miles, the way he took his coffee, the particular set of his jaw when Dominic delivered news he had anticipated but not wanted, the sound of his voice late at night through the study door when he thought she had already gone upstairs, lower and less guarded, carrying the specific weight of a man speaking to his closest people about things that mattered. She had stopped pretending she did not listen. She had stopped pretending a great many things. 2 weeks of feeling, with increasing clarity and decreasing resistance, the undeniable pull between them strengthened into something she could no longer file under circumstance or proximity, or the strange chemistry of 2 people forced into each other's orbit by a manipulative woman's miscalculation. It was more than that. She knew it was more than that. He knew she knew, and he waited with the same patient, absolute certainty he brought to everything, for her to be ready to say it aloud. She was not ready, not quite, but she was closer than she had been yesterday, and yesterday she had been closer than the day before, and the trajectory was becoming difficult to ignore. She had been sleeping better. The memories of Clara had continued, not every night, but often enough to build a picture that grew more detailed and more painful with each iteration. Her mother in that warm kitchen, speaking in careful code about a life she had buried. Her mother pressing the crescent moon pendant into Arya's small hands with an urgency that a child could feel but not understand. Her mother's face in the last memory that surfaced, drawn and serious, and carrying in it the particular expression of a woman who knows she is running out of time and has not yet finished the most important thing she will ever do. Arya kept the pendant close. Both of them, her mother's original and the one Matteo had placed on the vanity, the matched pair that represented, in their small silver symmetry, everything she had lost and everything she was beginning to find. The evening of the Thursday was ordinary. That was the part she would remember afterward with the sharpest clarity, how ordinary it had been. Dinner at the long table. Dominic reviewing the week's perimeter reports with his usual clipped efficiency. Felix arguing mildly with Ezra about a shipment schedule, while Luca watched them both with the tolerant amusement of a man who had seen this exact argument play out enough times to know how it would end. Matteo at the head of the table, His sleeves turned back, the tattoos at his throat catching the warm light from the iron fixtures overhead, eating with one hand and reviewing documents with the other in the way of a man whose work and life had long ago ceased to observe any boundary between them. She had been reading in the study afterward, a biography of a woman who had built a shipping empire in the 1920s. One of the books from the shelf Matteo had stocked for her, specific and deliberate, and exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself, which she had stopped finding unsettling and started finding, with a warmth she kept carefully contained, something closer to known. She was 40 pages in when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. A complete, total, instantaneous cessation of every electrical system in the building, executed with the surgical precision of people who had studied the estate's infrastructure and knew exactly which lines to cut and in what order. The darkness was absolute for approximately 3 seconds. Then the backup generators engaged. Not the main ones, she would learn later, because those had been disabled too, but a tertiary system that Matteo had installed separately, off-grid, connected to nothing the main system touched, because he was the kind of man who planned for the contingency behind the contingency behind the contingency. Dim red emergency lighting flooded the corridors, turning the estate's familiar architecture into something alien and urgent. And in that red-washed silence, Arya heard the first sound that told her this was not a malfunction. Gunfire, distant but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the eastern perimeter. She was on her feet before the book hit the floor. The study door opened, and Dominic was there. Not running, because men like Dominic did not run, but moving with the controlled, purposeful speed of someone whose body had been trained to treat emergencies as logistics problems requiring immediate and efficient solutions. He had a weapon in his hand and a radio in the other, and his face, in the red emergency light, was the face of the dangerous man beneath the composed exterior she had come to know over the past 2 weeks, calm on the surface and absolutely lethal underneath. "We have a breach," he said. His voice was level. "Eastern wall, at least 12, possibly more, armed, coordinated, professional. They took out the primary power and the main backup simultaneously." "Who?" Arya asked, and was distantly aware that the question came out steady, came out clear, came out as though she had been asking questions like this her entire life rather than for the first time in it. "Morno's people." Dominic's jaw tightened, the only visible concession to whatever he was feeling beneath the operational surface. "Or mercenaries working on Morno's money. We've been expecting a move, not this soon." She knew the name. Raphael Morno. She had heard it at the dinner table in the particular tone Matteo's people used for threats they took seriously, which was quieter and more careful than the tone they used for threats they did not. A rival syndicate boss who had been circling Matteo's territory for months, probing for weakness, testing boundaries with the patient, methodical aggression of a man who believed that Matteo's recent period of strategic repositioning, the manufactured rumors of bankruptcy, the deliberate withdrawal from public visibility, represented genuine vulnerability rather than the calculated misdirection it actually was. Morno had believed the lie, and now he was here to collect on it. "Where is Matteo?" she asked. "Eastern wing, coordinating the response." Dominic's eyes held hers with a directness that she understood in that moment was not merely informational but evaluative. He was watching her, watching how she processed this, watching what she did with the fear that was certainly present. She could feel it, cold and electric in her limbs, and what she chose to prioritize above it. "Mrs. Rivers, I need to get you to the safe room. 3rd floor, reinforced." "No." The word came out before she had consciously decided to say it. It came from somewhere below conscious decision, from a place in her chest where the fear lived alongside something else. Something that had been building for 2 weeks, for 2 years, for the entire length of her life spent being told that the appropriate response to crisis was to make herself small, to step aside, to allow the people who mattered to handle things while she occupied the least possible space and waited to be told what to do. She was finished with that. "No," she said again, and this time the word was not reflexive but chosen, delivered with the full weight of a woman who had spent 24 years being someone else's afterthought, and had decided, in one clear and irreversible moment, standing in the red emergency light of the first real home she had ever known, that she was not going to hide in a reinforced room while the people who had welcomed her into their lives fought to defend the walls she had started to call her own. Dominic looked at her for approximately 2 seconds. Whatever he saw in her face, and she would never know exactly what it was, though she suspected it was something he recognized, something that resonated with the loyalty built in blood and silence that governed every relationship in this house, made him nod once. "Stay behind me," he said. "Do exactly what I tell you, and if I say move, you move." "Understood." They went. The estate in crisis was a different animal than the estate at rest. The corridors that she had learned as quiet, book-lined passages between rooms of warmth and conversation were now channels of controlled urgency, populated by men she had seen at dinner tables and in morning briefings moving with a focus and coordination that spoke to years of preparation for exactly this kind of night. They communicated in short, coded bursts, hand signals, clipped radio exchanges, the particular shorthand of people who had trained together long enough that full sentences were an unnecessary luxury. Dominic moved her through the ground floor toward the eastern wing, where the sounds of engagement were closer and more specific. Not the distant percussion she had heard from the study, but individual exchanges, sharp and contained, the sound of a defensive line holding. They passed Felix in a doorway, armed and positioned with the kind of deliberate stillness that meant he was covering an approach route, and he looked at her as she passed, and his expression did something she did not expect. He smiled. Brief and sharp, and carrying in it something that looked, in the red light, very much like approval. They found Matteo in the eastern corridor. He was standing at the junction where the main hallway met the service passage that ran along the estate's eastern wall, and he was not, as she might have expected, behind cover or positioned defensively. He was standing in the open, his radio in one hand and his attention distributed across 3 simultaneous channels of information. Ezra's voice coming through the radio, Luca's position visible through the corridor window, the feed from the remaining cameras displayed on a tablet propped against the wall beside him. He was running the defense the way he ran everything else. From the center, with complete visibility, with the absolute and unhurried authority of a man who had built this world, specifically so that when it was threatened, he would be the axis around which its protection turned. When he saw her, something happened in his face. It was not anger, though she had braced for that, had expected him to demand to know why she was not in the safe room, had prepared herself for the particular brand of protective fury that men in his position deployed when the people they cared about did not behave according to plan. What she saw instead was something she had never seen in his expression before, something that lived beneath the composure and the authority and the 3 years of patient certainty, and had, until this moment, never been given a reason to surface. Fear, genuine, unconcealed, devastating fear, not for himself, not for the estate, not for the operation, for her. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then it was replaced by something else, a recognition, similar in quality to the one she had seen at the altar but deeper, more complex, carrying in it the specific understanding of a man watching someone become, in real time, the person he had always known they were. "She wouldn't go to the safe room," Dominic said, with the neutral precision of a man delivering an operational fact. Matteo looked at her. The red emergency light traced the lines of his tattoos, the set of his jaw, the particular architecture of a face that had been making decisions about her safety for 3 years and was now confronted with the reality that she had made one of her own. "No," he said quietly, "she wouldn't." It was not permission. It was acknowledgement. And the difference between those two things, Arya realized in that corridor with the sound of gunfire and radio chatter and the controlled chaos of a defensive operation in full execution around her, was the entire distance between the life she had been living and the life she had chosen. She stayed. She stayed because she understood, with a clarity that felt like the first honest thought she had ever had about herself, that this was the moment. Not a supernatural awakening. Not a mystical transformation. Something far more real and far more costly. The moment a woman who had been told for her entire life that she was disposable decided, with her whole body and her whole mind and her whole heart beating hard against her ribs in a red-lit corridor, that she was not. That she had never been. That every person who had ever treated her as an expendable variable in someone else's equation had been wrong, and she was finished, permanently, irrevocably finished, allowing their wrongness to define her. The fear did not leave. She wanted to be honest about that with herself and with whatever came after. The fear stayed exactly where it was, cold and electric in her hands and her throat. But it stopped being the loudest thing in the room. It stopped being the thing she organized her decisions around. It became, instead, one factor among several, present, acknowledged, and subordinate to the choice she had made to stand in this hallway, in this house. Beside this man, and these people who had treated her as permanent from the first morning, she came downstairs looking for coffee, and found instead a table where she was expected. She was not a fighter. She did not pick up a weapon. She did not perform some cinematic transformation from civilian to combatant that would have been dishonest to who she actually was. What she did was this. She stayed at the communications junction where Matteo was coordinating the defense, and she listened, and she watched, and when the information moving through the radios and the camera feeds became too much for one person to track simultaneously, because that was the reality of a coordinated assault, that it generated more data than any single mind could process while also making tactical decisions, she began to help. It started small, relaying Ezra's position updates to Matteo when he was occupied on another channel, tracking the camera feeds for movement in sectors he was not currently watching, noting the patterns in the attackers' approach, the way they probed the western flank every time a push came from the east, the timing interval between their coordinated advances, the specific gap in their formation that opened every time they regrouped. She had spent her life watching. She had spent her life reading the patterns in other people's behavior, Beatrice's moods, Savannah's demands, the invisible architecture of a household designed to keep her small. She had thought that skill was a symptom of her powerlessness. She was learning, in real time, that it was something considerably more useful than that. "They're cycling," she said to Matteo during a brief lull, and he turned to her with that attentive stillness she knew well, the quality of a man who listened the way most people forgot to. "Every 4 minutes, the eastern push draws your people forward, and then the western team tests the secondary entrance. 4 minutes exactly. They're on a timer." He looked at her for a beat. Then he looked at the camera feeds, and she watched him verify what she had seen. The pattern, the interval, the exploitable rhythm of an assault team that was coordinated but not adaptive, following a plan rather than responding to conditions. "Dominic," he said into the radio, and his voice was calm and certain and carrying that quality she had learned to recognize as the moment he stopped defending and started deciding. "Pull 2 from the eastern line, reposition to the western secondary. They're going to hit it in," he looked at Arya. 90 seconds, she said. 90 seconds, he repeated into the radio. They were ready when it came. The western push met a reinforced position instead of the skeleton coverage the attackers had expected, and the engagement that followed was brief and decisive, and ended with Morno's mercenaries retreating through the tree line with significantly fewer operational personnel than they had arrived with. The all-clear came 40 minutes later. The main power was restored. The red emergency lighting gave way to the estate's familiar warm glow, and the transition felt, to Arya, like surfacing, like coming up from deep water into air and light, and the particular quality of quiet that follows a storm. The corridors filled with the sounds of aftermath, radios being secured, positions being stood down, the controlled exhale of an organization that had been tested and had held. She was standing in the eastern corridor when they found her. Not Matteo. He was still managing the operational wind down, the communications with outer perimeter security, the dozen logistical threads that needed attention after a breach of this scale. It was the others who came. Dominic first. He walked toward her down the corridor with his weapon holstered and his face carrying the expression she had seen on it only once before the first morning, when she had come downstairs and told him to keep the gate closed. Quietly, privately satisfied. He stopped in front of her, and he did something she did not expect and would remember for the rest of her life. He extended his hand, not the brief, professional handshake he had given her on the first day. This was different, held longer, gripped firmer, carrying in its pressure a communication that did not require and would not have benefited from words. It was the gesture of a man acknowledging an equal, a person who had earned, through action rather than title, the loyalty of people who did not give it easily and did not give it twice. "Mrs. Rivers," he said, and the name sounded different in his mouth this time. Not strange, not new, settled, as though it had finished becoming true. Felix came next, from the doorway where he had been covering the approach route, and his smile was wider now, unguarded in a way that his carefully maintained sharpness usually did not permit. He did not shake her hand. He put his fist over his heart, briefly and without ceremony, in a gesture she had seen the men in this house use with each other and never with anyone outside their circle. It was not explained. It did not need to be. Ezra appeared from the eastern wing and gave her a nod, one precise, economical inclination of his head that was, from a man who catalogued everything and wasted nothing, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Luca arrived last, silver-templed and unhurried even now, and he looked at her with the calm, knowing eyes of a man who had seen a great many things in his life and understood which of them mattered. "The boss chose well," he said, simple, final, a verdict delivered by someone whose verdicts, she was learning, were not revisited. She stood in that corridor and received each acknowledgement and felt them land, one by one, in the same place in her chest where the fear had lived an hour ago. Not replacing the fear, nothing so simple as that. Settling in beside it. Building something in the space the fear had made, the way a foundation is laid in ground that has been broken open. Not comfortable, not painless, but solid, and permanent, and entirely unmistakably earned. Matteo found her in the garden at dawn. She had gone there when the last of the operational noise had faded, and the estate had settled into the particular quiet that follows crisis. Not peace exactly, but the exhausted, grateful silence of a structure that has been tested to its limits and discovered that its limits were sufficient. She was standing near the oak tree. Her shoes were beside her in the grass. The first light was coming through the eastern trees in long, pale lines, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of dew, and the faint, dissipating residue of smoke from the perimeter. She heard him this time. Or rather, she heard the absence of the particular silence he usually moved in, a deliberate choice, she understood. He was letting her know he was there, giving her the option. She did not turn, she did not need to. He came to stand beside her, alongside, never opposite. The consistency of that, the quiet, repeated declaration it made about how he understood his position relative to hers, settled into her chest with the rest of it. The acknowledgments and the fear and the clean, expansive thing that had opened inside her in a red-lit corridor when she decided, finally and completely, who she was. "You should have gone to the safe room," he said. "Yes," she agreed. A pause. She could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cold morning air. "Are you going to tell me not to do it again?" "No," his voice was quiet. "I am going to tell you that watching you stand in that corridor and refuse to be put away was the single most terrifying and the single most clarifying moment of my life." He paused again, and the pause had weight, the kind of weight that comes before words a person has been holding for a long time and has only now found the conditions to release. "I spent 3 years knowing what you were to me. Tonight was the first time I understood what you are to yourself." She turned to look at him then. The dawn light was tracing the tattoos at his throat in gold, the way it had on other mornings, but everything about the image was different now because everything about the person looking at it was different. She was not the woman who had walked down that aisle in a dress that did not fit. She was not the girl who had closed her eyes while Beatrice's voice came through the floorboards like smoke. She was not the afterthought, the spare, the variable to be adjusted. She was the woman who had stood in a corridor during an armed assault on her home and helped coordinate its defense because she had decided, not been told, not been permitted, decided, that this was her place and these were her people, and she was not going to be put in a room while they were threatened. She was the heir to a legacy her mother had hidden to protect her, and her stepmother had buried to exploit her. And she was going to reclaim every piece of it on her own terms. She was the wife of a man who had spent 3 years building a door and waiting for her to walk through it, not because he doubted she would, but because he understood that the walking had to be hers. She looked at Matteo Rivers in the early morning light and felt the undeniable connection between them, not a mystical force, not a supernatural compulsion, but something far more powerful than either of those things. The specific, irreplaceable recognition of two people who had chosen each other. He had chosen her 3 years ago in the certainty of his gut. She was choosing him now, in the clarity of a morning that came after the hardest night of her life, with her bare feet in the grass and her mother's pendant warm from being held, and the full, honest weight of everything she now knew herself to be. "Matteo," she said. He waited. He always waited. It was one of the things she was choosing. "I'm not going anywhere." Something moved in his face, the composure fracturing, not breaking but opening, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has finally turned the handle. And underneath it she saw what he had been holding for 3 years with the particular discipline of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed and must simply be endured until they are ready to be received. Everything, all of it. The full, unguarded, devastating force of a love that had been patient enough to wait and certain enough to never waver and strong enough to build an entire world around the shape of a woman he had not yet been allowed to reach. He lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried precision that governed every movement he made. His fingers found the pendant at her throat, Clara's pendant, the original warm from Arya's skin, and rested there against the small silver crescent, against the steady pulse beneath it. "I know," he said. She covered his hand with hers. The metal of the pendant pressed between their palms, warm from contact, warm from being held, carrying no power but the specific and sufficient power of a thing that had been loved and kept and passed from one woman to another across the distance of death and silence, and 20 years of someone else's lies. The oak tree stood in its patient, centuries-deep stillness above them. The estate's grounds stretched in every direction, solid and permanent and defended. Behind them, through the tall windows, the house was beginning to wake Dominic's voice in the corridor, the sound of coffee being made, the quiet, purposeful sounds of people resuming the ordinary rhythm of a life they had fought to keep. Her people, her home, her life, chosen and claimed and earned in a red-lit corridor on a Thursday night when she decided that she was finished being the version of herself that other people had designed. She leaned into him. He absorbed the weight of her the way he absorbed everything, completely, without adjustment, as though he had always been structured to hold exactly this. The morning light reached the garden in full. Arya Rivers stood in it, bare feet in the grass, her hand over his hand over her heart, and felt, with a certainty that required no supernatural origin, because it was built from something stronger than the supernatural, built from choice and courage and the irreversible decision to be, finally and permanently, her own, felt, for the first time in her life, like the origin. Not the afterthought, not the sacrifice, not the spare. The origin, the center, the woman the story had always been about. If you believe everyone deserves to break free from the systems that tried to keep them small and finally claim the power that was always theirs, subscribe now and comment, "I claim my power," because Arya just showed us all what it looks like when you stop apologizing for what you are.